I doubt we're ever going to get numbers for this on certain, but I would be curious to find out if Amazon were to be transparent on this front, how much money was spent in the realm of marketing, and how much attention was given to that versus the actual project itself. Because as far as what I've seen, Amazon has been hammering out advertisements for this show, especially over the last couple of weeks. Trailers, especially. I mean, this show hasn't had much in the way of teases over its entire run of deliberation and when we first, as the public, knew about it. I mean, we've known about it for several years, and part of that, I'm sure, might be due to production delays amid 2020 and all that. But I'd be curious to find out again just how much money has been spent, because ever since the Super Bowl of this year, we have had. And there was a bit of a wide berth in there in regard to a trailer debuting, but in the last couple of weeks, they've really ramped up. Maybe it's just because they're like, typical of other shows, they're trying to get the advertisement out to get every audience member on their eyes as soon as possible. Maybe people who aren't aware of it just yet. And then there always are some. Or perhaps it's to combat the general stink of the show that's been going around. I've spoken to this. I'm not going to try to give too many long-winded points on this, because I've already spoken about this in previous coverage I've given to The Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power quite extensively. But this show has a bit of an animus to it. I'm sure Amazon didn't wish that were the case, but it is sort of self-inflicted. As I've stated previously, I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan, even though, in all honesty, I've not read the books yet. It's still something I'm trying to work on. I had a bit of a different venturing into this territory than others did. I'm sure most people started with the books, and most of those are, I'm sure, taught in, grade school classes and English classes, like in high school or college, right? I only read The Hobbit back in middle school, I think. I don't remember exactly. Most people have the standpoint of starting with the books, and then I'm sure most of them ventured in the films, and perhaps even, more jumped into video games. I had the opposite path in that the video games were my first entry. Then I jumped into the films. The extended editions, in fact, I've seen those as well. Not for The Hobbit, only for The Lord of the Rings. And then at some point, I'll jump into the books. I don't know when that'll be. There's a lot of stuff I'm trying to juggle around right now in regard to reading and coverage. I have a very bogged schedule at the moment, but at some point I'll be able to read the books. So going into this, I'm very familiarized with the world of Lord of the Rings for the adaptations, right? The films, of course, are deeply relevant, or reverent, I'm sure, for many people. But Amazon has produced something rather, a bit of an enigma in comparison to where Lord of the Rings has been in the past. I would even say that the Lord of the Rings portrayals in the video games are more faithful in spirit. The other angle to which I'm coming at this, and I refrain from saying I'm a Tolkien purist, not in spirit. In that term, in the affiliation, I completely agree. I don't want to give an unnecessary, an incorrect assumption, though, to someone who's like, well, you're a Tolkien purist, you must be knowledgeable on the lore. I'm not. Like I said, I haven't read the books. But in spirit of preserving Tolkien's work as written, because I understand, even as somebody who's not read the books, the prominence of history that those books have encapsulated, how they're classical English literature, how they're revered among many readers and fans. And even then, the vision of the lore as Tolkien created it, without even going too deeply into researching this yet. I would like to look more into it. In fact, there's a video I came across today that was sort of speaking about this trailer and project in regards to the religious backdrop of Lord of the Rings. There's a significance to the Lord of the Rings as not only a work of English fiction, but as a literary classic and a reverent piece of fantasy that this show, whereas, I'd say other adaptations like the films or even some of the video games have embodied to the best of their ability, maybe not perfectly, but as best they can. There's something about this show that just doesn't feel like it compares to that energy, right? When I've covered this trailer previously, for me at the very least, it's a sweeping epic in regard to money. I mean, they've certainly spent a lot in manifesting the vision of Lord of the Rings that aesthetically is very similar to the films. But it's very lacking in substance to the point that I said it comes across to me as generic fantasy. And this show certainly has to win over a lot of people, right? Because there's much we know about the show from the background. So far, the fans are not won over. And for the majority, at least the response has been nothing short of critical. And that is the way it should be if you understand the sensibilities of his project and not necessarily being the best married to Tolkien's interpretation or his vision or the lore. I mean, I'm kind of fascinated again to see just how much is preserved here, if anything. I mean, in the last trailer, they touted out his name like, oh, it's based on the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. But what we know, it seems to be, there's a lot of revisions. There's feeling again of emptiness. And almost like Lord of the Rings, the Rings of Power, doesn't have the soul that Lord of the Rings has. Even the films. In particular, the way the show has treated people that have been involved with the production. I mean, we recently learned about Peter Jackson being ghosted, as the headlines have called it. I mean, that seems disrespectful, especially when he spent so much time making revered projects, award-winning projects, in fact. People have seen those movies, how many times? I can't tell you how many times I've watched the Lord of the Rings movies. You have a show that is, in many ways, seemingly devoid of what Tolkien produced. And instead has been hijacked by for people who are like, oh, we want to morph Lord of the Rings into something that it wasn't originally envisioned as. And these trailers have spoken to that as well. Again, it might be temptingly beautiful. You might see like, oh, there's a Balrog or there's an orc. Oh, it's Lord of the Rings, at least in appearance. But it just comes across as still weakened to me. Let's take one more look at this trailer, this program. So far, I've had very mixed feelings, and still I would say the ghost ultimately that glares over this, given that it is in many ways devoid of Tolkien. This series is premiering on the anniversary of his passing. That will, as much as I'm sure Amazon wishes that weren't the case, it seems like, in many respects, that this series debuting on his passing day, it's like they're sort of pissing on his grave. Maybe that's a bit of a melodramatic phrasing, but it's sort of what's happening here. Anywho, last trailer. Here we go. Or the official. These are designated weird too. Like I guess this is sort of categorized as trailer number 1 or trailer number 2, or you could say a final trailer, given that we've had so many teasers, and then the San Diego Comic-Con trailer, which you could call a trailer. I'm going to call this trailer 2, just in the reference, but I'm like, I don't even know what to call it. I'm getting lost in the trailer designation here. Anyway, here we go. The music's very typical for, or I shouldn't say music, the audio choice for big fantasy epics.
Gave his life hunting the enemy. His task is now mine.
Seriously?
Stand with me.
Boy, this is gonna be an interesting ride.
Not fate, nor destiny.
I wouldn't have picked that song to start it, because that's gonna make this show look really bad. Although the song's audio has a nice energy to it that kind of sounds like it fits the lore, but the words.
Everyone must decide who we shall be.
I am not the hero you seek.
Well, if you know spoilers, I think we've gotten word of who he is.
This will be your kingdom.
You see, again, very pretty visual environments, but
Choose not the path of fear, but that of faith.
One thing we can do, better than any creature in all Middle-earth, we stay true to each other with our hearts even bigger than our feet.
We can survive this. You and I.
Commander! Wait! No! We keep moving!
Why do you keep fighting?
There is a tempest in me.
that was an interesting line. Although I don't.
Put up your sword.
It's not just an appearance. I don't see the performance that is along the lines of Cate Blanchett for Galadriel.
Without it, what am I to be?
Okay, the way that started out, the tune overall, especially as the trailer went on, I like the violins. It has a real symphonic feel, and I think that definitely fit in well with a fantasy epic like The Lord of the Rings. And I've spoken as well in the past, there was another trailer, I think it was one of the first ones, where the words were kind of weird in terms of the lyrical choices, but I thought the energy of the track from a sound perspective, it had a bit of a European vibe. And as somebody who's a big fan of like symphonic European metal especially, it's something that appeals to me, and it has that overall sound. I'm like, it's a favorite genre. But the words that started out with, speak your truth. That speaks a lot to the sensibilities of what's happening, at least in the interpretation of the show in its modern iteration. Doesn't it? For me, I'm like, cut the relativist BS in terms of the real world. I was like, truth is not subjective. Perception, outlook, interpretation, perhaps, but not truth. That's a side point, though. But, just that line alone speaks to where I would imagine, and what I believe based on what we know, that the writers are coming from for this show. And again, it looks like it has the Lord of the Rings aesthetic in terms of the world, especially with the films, even though Peter Jackson is not involved here, it seems. Even some of the creatures, that's kind of weird, though. Again, as much of an illusion as this paints this being a good show from its environmental depiction, again, it's just a beautiful piece of art to look at, especially from the environments. This waterfall mountain construction is just gorgeous. It's lacking in substance. Even then, you watch all this stuff and you're like, it still feels like you spent all this money to make this beautiful, like, tourist village. But the story and the character depictions feel really hollow to me. Like, there's this voidness. I don't know. Maybe you disagree with me. I'm just like, I don't see much reason to watch this beyond, well, to find out, number one, just how far they go in departing from Tolkien. But there's this feeling as you watch it that, like, Lord of the Rings, with its depiction in terms of the story, has lost what made it so unique. Again, if the visuals are complemented by a story that is in line with what Tolkien wrote, that'd be a very different story. And I'm sure maybe people have less criticism for it. But because of the deviations, it makes it feel just like a generic show. By the way, in regards to airtime, I didn't realize this either because I've never watched Game of Thrones, but House of the Dragon's airing, and the headlines have made it no secret that show is doing very well, especially among fan reception, it seems. For the most part, from what I've heard. Many people are watching it. Which is going to be more superior, though? That's, Lord of the Rings versus Game of Thrones are both like tentpole fantasy stories. Very different ones. They're very distinct. But I wonder which one's going to do better. I think perhaps Game of Thrones. I think at least among audiences, from a review perspective, probably. I still watch this, and I'm like, it's the same feeling I've had over the majority of trailers. It just feels void of something. And I think it has to do with what we know. That definitely paints a ghost over the show. And like I said, Tolkien's anniversary, that the show will never be able to depart from the debuting this on the anniversary of his death. That's not only disrespectful, it's a horrible look, especially if a series does not deliver on what it should be doing, which is maintaining Tolkien's vision and preserving it, which this show is not. Even if, again, there's certain deviations made. I've spoken as well, being a Tolkien purist and a Lord of the Rings fan. I've said in the past, perhaps people disagree with my take on this, but the Middle-earth games, I love those, and those did play around with the lore a bit in some regards. There's no secret to that, but even then it still felt like the story and the tone, it felt like it was in line with not only the movies, but it felt like it was actually trying to maintain that story. Or there's still a reverence for it. Versus this, which has repeatedly been overshadowed by this feeling of separation. You can point out all the ads you want. And even then, I'm still kind of wondering, how exactly tied is this to the lore? Because, if those are wargs, they look different. Maybe they're not allowed to use wargs. I don't know. Even the Galadriel's in here. I'm not exactly, I have no idea anymore. This is just such a convoluted show. I mean, maybe the visuals will be tempting enough to bring you in from the visual perspective. Maybe the music and the score will be engrossing. Again, I don't think the lyrics were as much, but the sound of that tune was definitely fit into a fantasy line. The one line about the Tempest from Galadriel's actress, though, again, she and Elrond look nothing like Hugo Weaving or Cate Blanchett. And even like the overall performance, I mean, the line might sound good, but the way that this is showcased, it just doesn't feel like Lord of the Rings to me. But it's like there's a staging here that doesn't. It feels inconsistent. What are your guys' thoughts of this show? I think it's going to be interesting in the timing we're in, given that we're only a couple days away from this debuting. Again, I'm going to try to have this out on time, best of my ability, as best I can. But at this point, we've heard a lot from what the fans have seen in the way of the trailer and what Amazon has chosen to produce in the way of a vision of the show, or adjacent markets that perhaps know a little more, who Amazon's let in. What's going to be interesting to witness, again, is the overall response when the show drops. What is the audience going to say? I don't think we know just yet. I think we've gotten a taste for that based on the trailers and the response, but I don't think we've certainly, that's speaking in anticipation and not as much in the final product. This should be interesting. I don't know. Brace yourselves, apparently, I guess. Let me know your thoughts, though, down below, what you think about this. Again, I'm not trying to be unreasonable in my criticism of the show. I just see a lot of weak points with it, where if you're somebody who perhaps has not ventured into Lord of the Rings before, and you're like, where should I start? Start with I would say, ideally, depart from my path and start with the books. And then, maybe go to the films or go to the video games. Like I said, the video games were my point of entry before I watched even the movies. Lego Lord of the Rings was the project that really brought me in. That's my favorite title overall in that line, and just it's a great game. But the world of Lord of the Rings, which is complemented by a great story and a fantasy, again, adventure epic with beautiful undertones and a dynamic mythology. I don't sense that here. I just see baseline fantasy show with a lot of money put into manifesting the world of Tolkien and making it look somewhat adjacent to the movies without the Tolkien or Lord of the Rings side. There's still, again, as much as Amazon puts out in the way of trailers here, and they can spend probably all their money on marketing, it's not going to sugarcoat the reality, but there's still an aspect of a show that, as much as you've glammed up everything, it still feels hollow. And that is a disappointment, because I wish I could say that this was a show with brilliant substance and that it was in line of Tolkien's vision, but I can't. Thank you so much for watching this video. Before you bounce, feel free to drop a like and comment, subscribe to this channel with a ding on the bell, and share this video with your friends. And consider checking out the description here. There you'll find links to my other channels, as well as addresses to my other social media accounts and ways you can help support my work if you feel so inclined. May God bless you, and looking forward to when our paths cross again.